This is Peter Harrell, and welcome to the Security Economics Podcast. We're going deep this week on a topic that most of my U.S. listeners think about in April, taxes. But we're talking about taxes not because I'm trying to reinvent this podcast as a personal finance show, but because tax policy is an essential part of the U.S. national security toolkit. How does the U.S. encourage companies to make domestic investments in manufacturing? Sure, grants are going to be a part of the toolkit, but tax credits are probably going to be a far more important part of the policy mix. Plus, as my guest, Georgetown law professor Itai Grinberg points out, somebody's got to pay for the government, and that's where the tax man comes in. Grinberg previously served in the Treasury Department and brings hands-on experience with international tax negotiations as well. We also discuss his views on President Trump's favorite taxes, tariffs, as well as Trump's new export tax on computer chip sales to China. I think you'll like Itai's historical analogy. It's a great discussion, and I think you'll enjoy this one. Itai Grinberg, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Peter, so nice to see you. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk about tax, which is not a topic I've previously discussed on the podcast. It is obviously a topic that all of us care about, not just because of policy issues, but because come sometime in mid-April, we have to be thinking about it. Or maybe people who are more organized than I am are thinking about this in January and February. For me, it's an April endeavor.
It's an October endeavor. We filed for the extension.
Oh, there you go. Right. You can keep this going all year. If that's really what you want to do. This is a national security and economic security podcast. And I really am interested in talking with you about tax because it does seem that tax policy is something the U.S. uses across a whole range of issues that has a really broad impact on our economics, on our national security. But maybe I'll just start the interview, Itai, by throwing it over to you. Why should the national security community care about tax policy?
I think that we should care about tax policy for two different sets of reasons. One reason is it turns out that in the United States, we use tax policy to create incentives for behaviors that we want because in the U.S., tax legislation creates semi-permanent policy that sticks in the code until it's amended or repealed. So it's a relatively easy way to produce a subsidy that's long-lasting, whereas spending provisions tend to change every Congress, which is why tax is by far the most important way that we subsidize stuff that we want, like people to do, whether that be individuals or businesses. That's one thing. The other thing is, at the end of the day, national security is pretty deeply tied to a government that can fund itself. If we had a bond market crisis, that would have national security implications too. And we have a pretty scary fiscal position. And sometimes I just describe in my class the U.S. government. If you go to law school, you hear all of this stuff that's just focused on the courts, right? And I say, you really should think of the U.S. government as basically an insurance company with an army and a tax system to pay for it. Okay. And then I show them a graph of where all the money goes, right? All the money gets raised by the tax system. And then look, 90+% of the spending is either on the insurance company, so Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or defense. That's where all the money goes. That's the system. So there's three parts of the system that matters. The tax code, the army, and like Homeland Security, the insurance company, that's the whole caboodle, okay? Everything else is noise. But national security people, they don't really realize they need someone to raise the money.
Yeah,
right?
They do focus on the army part of it, that's for sure. But you're right. I often think they don't think that much about where the money's actually coming from.
Right, like they need the money. So we're the money. That's why you should care.
A very fair point. We're the money. That's a good way for the national security community to think about the tax code. I want to drill in a little bit on the first part of the answer you mentioned, which is this idea that the tax code ends up being, as you characterize it, a stable and long-term way of giving incentives for behavior that the U.S. government wants to reward. And it has seemed to me, at least under the Biden administration, we began to see that in the industrial policy context in particular. So we have the CHIPS Act. I think a lot of people thinking about the CHIPS Act from the news are very focused on grant program in CHIPS Act and now on whether President Trump's going to take a 10% stake in Intel as a part of this. But actually, there's also a tax code provision part of the CHIPS Act. My understanding, you probably know it better than I do, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of that was tax code, production incentives, investment incentives. Maybe you just walk us through a little bit, Itai, how the tax code can drive investment and production and things that the national security community might like to see done here.
Well, look, I guess I should be clear. Starting out, my general view is that I wish we did industrial policy only when we absolutely have to, for reasons of either national security or because of some set of clear positive or negative externalities from not doing so. It's not like I'm like, let's always do this. I think we should be very selective about it. And then I'm not saying that in any country in the world you would want to rely on the tax system. I'm just saying that the reality is that in the United States, we can use the tax code because, look, a dollar not paid and a dollar given are basically the same. And now we've even come up with this concept of transferable credits, which we created in the IRA. So now we've even figured out, even if you don't owe money, and even if we don't, as a government, want to directly give you a refund, which is something called a refundable credit, we can give you something you can sell in the marketplace so that you can get cash from other private sector actors if you don't have tax liability. So it's a really effective way to distribute money without the government directly writing checks. And for some reason in the United States, we're totally fine with reducing people's taxes as a political matter in both parties, but we're not so okay in many cases with writing subsidy checks, right? And so we just turn out to be more comfortable with it politically. And then separately, we don't need it to be reauthorized in every Congress because it's not spending. It's a tax rule. And so it's just there until you change it, which is a really big political difference, right? Not every country is like that, but we are. And so the tax code becomes a really powerful way to do any kind of subsidy policy. And yeah, you're right. The IRA, the bulk of its money is tax money. A lot of chips was tax money too. And that's not like some weird exception. Our biggest subsidy for work is a tax subsidy, the earned income tax credit. Our biggest subsidy for child support is an income tax credit, the child tax credit. Like, we just do tax credits instead of writing checks. Other governments write checks. We don't.
That's a really fair point. Just for whatever reason, the politics of our system make it easier to provide the subsidy through the tax code than through the spending side of the ledger. And I also very much do take your point, and I hadn't ever really thought about it that way before. There is just this inherent benefit of, if you want to provide an incentive to, say, produce semiconductors in the U.S., unless there is a sunset on the tax credit, it would exist for indefinitely. Whereas if you are appropriating money in our system, that usually means every year you got to fight anew for a new appropriation.
That's the fundamental difference. And that's why we have the system we have.
What advice, if you are a Hill staffer, what advice would you have, Itai, for a Hill staffer who wants to promote a industrial policy in, say, shipbuilding, to think of something that's a hot topic now? What advice would you give a Hill staffer on here's how to think about smart tax code industrial policy for the shipbuilding sector?
Oh, my God. Well, so first of all, I should give a caveat that I've not thought about the shipbuilding sector, and I genuinely believe that you should want the people who pitch how to do industrial policy through the code to be doing it really remorsefully and reluctantly, right? They should do it because they think we really have to, not because it seems like a great idea and, oh, here's another thing we can spend some money on. But let's assume that we crossed that bar, and I knew that there was a real national security reason.
Let's posit we do.
Building industry.
Let's posit we do. Agree for the sake of argument, even if you're not sold on the merits.
I don't know about the merits, but let's talk about. You would want probably some amount of like credits in connection with investment. I mean, I don't know enough about shipbuilding, right? I don't know if we even have the yards anymore. But assuming we don't have the yards, like, here's the credit we give you. I assume then we'd have to the question, will the Congress allow refundability or not?
So refundability would be, just unpack that concept. Yeah. It's just a level settlement. Right now, other than military naval ships, which we do build at very high cost, but we do build naval ships, and then we build a certain number of Boston whaler pleasure yacht kind of things. But let's posit we don't have a lot of capacity to build cargo ships of any kind, and we want to get a Korean company to come in and start helping us build cargo ships. That's what the target
is. And they're going to need a yard, right?
Yeah.
And so you probably want some kind of investment tax credit that says, look, as you put the yard together, here's a credit that we give you, okay, which presumably in the U.S., as they're building the yard, they won't have tax liability up front. So
that's true. It'll be a few years probably before they actually have to pay any taxes.
Exactly. Yeah. They're not going to make any money up front. So they need just like the developer in a green credit project, they need to be able to get the money right away in order for the credit to be meaningful. And so there's only two ways to do that. One is refundability. That says the government literally says, this is the kind of credit where you file a return and you say, I have $1 billion in refundable credits. Therefore, the government writes me $1 billion check. That's actually the way we originally thought about doing the green provisions. So if you look at the original Build Back Better rules and the IRA until the end of March of 2022, that's how it was written. But then people said, we think there's going to be too much fraud because of this. And Joe Manchin in particular thought that because he thought we had a lot of fraud in the child tax credit space in particular, and he thought this would be the same. And there's some reason to think he might have been right. Because when you looked at what happened with the employer retention credit during the pandemic, we had some of that. This is not perfect. So the other way you can do it is you can do it as a transferable credit. The good thing about a transferable credit is basically it says find someone who actually has tax liability and let them buy it and tell them that, by the way, if they buy it, they're on the hook if there was any fraud. And the reason that's important is the buyers turn out to be these big multinationals who make money year after year, and the IRS can actually come after them, whereas they can't really come after a fraudster because the fraudster disappears. And so the transferable credit structure is not bad. It works. And we're getting better and better at having relatively liquid markets in those things. So the Korean company gets a credit while it's building the shipyard, and it can sell that credit, however much subsidy you wanted to give them, at 97 cents on the dollar. And so it gets cash right away, okay? And that gives it cash to do the stuff. And then you have a production tax credit, which basically says, okay, I mean, I don't know what the right metrics are, right? And I don't know how much you should subsidize it by, but like every time you produce a ship, you get this much money, right? That's sort of how it works. And that's the same way that stuff works in the green credit space, right? There are metrics based on the amount of investment you're putting into a facility and metrics based on the amount of production of energy that the facility is creating that produce credits that developers, if they don't have profitability at the time, can, if they choose, they can either use it to reduce their own taxes or they can sell it. Although obviously in principle it's the same, but without facially the government writing a check, which apparently is the thing that in this country politically we hate. So there you go. You've solved the problem. And so I'd advise that, some combination of ITCs and PTCs. It works.
Let me pivot a little bit. We've talked about the tax expenditure side of the equation, but I think any discussion of tax policy today, and certainly discussion as both national security and tax policy, would be remiss if we didn't talk about the president's favorite set of taxes, which is tariffs. We have a president who I think it is fair to say is essentially unique among American policymakers and American economists in his deep and abiding love for tariffs.
For now. You never know.
That's true.
He thinks he's the future, but yeah, okay.
It's certainly been a love of tariffs. It is unlike anything I have experienced, even as somebody who's dealt with policymakers who've been pretty protectionist in their own way, but not quite the way Trump is. We can have a long conversation about the trade policy pros and cons of tariffs, the risks of tariffs. But where I'd actually like to start is on the tax policy side of tariffs, because Trump does go out and he talks about how the tariffs are increasing revenue, how the tariffs are going to pay off the deficit, or he has some very grandiose ambitions for a tax and fiscal policy position about what the tariffs can do. Could you walk us through a little bit about how you, as a tax expert, see tariffs as tax policy?
So let's just do the numbers first, right? Monthly tariff revenue right now is running like what, $25 to $30 billion. Long-term estimates on tariffs are hard because you should realistically incorporate dynamic and behavioral effects that might not have kicked in yet. But let's just say that $25 billion per month on average is sustainable if you wanted it to be as policy. Okay, let's just hypothesize that. So $25 billion, that'd be $300 billion per year or $3 trillion over 10. Okay. Then you have some estimators that, start adjusting for eventual behavioral effects, some demand reduction, some GDC reduction through macroeconomic impacts. Some people say, well, if it's $3 trillion on a static basis, maybe it's as low as $2.5 trillion over 10, but let's just stick with 3. If it's 3, that's significant, but it doesn't fundamentally change the U.S. fiscal position really at all. As a point of comparison, if you took everything in the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill, OBBB. I'll call it OB3, as us tax people now do, because we say it too often. No, OB3 extended everything in there over 10 years. So if you took everything and had it last for the entirety of the 10-year window, no tax on tips, no tax on overtimes, all that, and you factored in any additional interest costs from the lost revenue, basically various estimation parameters say it costs about somewhere between 3 trillion and 5 trillion. So maybe the tariff revenue offsets the revenue losses from OB3, maybe, but it doesn't achieve anything else. We're still running $1.5 trillion plus annual deficits. We're still at 100% of GDP in terms of debt. We're still headed towards 120% plus, like within 10 years. Not solving any problems. Definitely not eliminating the IRS. Not happening.
So you're telling me I'm going to have to still file my taxes every year?
You sure are. And realize, like, all of this, every time we decide not to pay for stuff, which we've really become absurd about, we're not deciding that no one's going to pay it. We're deciding that our kids are going to pay it. That's what we're deciding. The perspective of the way I think about the baby boomers, in which I increasingly think about our generation as possibly being the same, is I'll be gone, you'll be gone. We just don't care. We're going to dump it on our kids and let them clean up the mess, which is terrible. And will eventually have a national security consequence too, right? They're going to have to come up with money.
Actually, let me ask you, Itai, to unpack this a little bit. It's interesting to hear you talking about the fiscal situation, because this is an issue that I guess I'll characterize myself as middle-aged. I remember 90s, 2000s, late 80s. There's a lot of talk about the deficit and efforts to close the deficit. I have distinct memories of President Clinton being very proud that we had 2 brief years of a surplus. And then the last 25 years, there doesn't really even seem to be much discussion about it. How serious do you think the fiscal hole we are getting into is?
First of all, I'll say that I do think that in hindsight, I think there was some amount of crying wolf that then made everyone stop worrying about these problems, right? But there has to be a moment when investors decide that the U.S. government is no longer guaranteed to pay off its debt. The question is, how much debt do we have to have when they decide that? I don't know the answer to that question, but we know it's happened to countries and it creates real crises. Bond market crises are a big deal. Now, the odds that the U.S. has that immediately, who knows? But the only reason that people seem to still put money into the U.S. as foreigners is because I sometimes describe it as the least bad looking horse in the glue factory. I mean, if you look at other developed world countries, they have as bad fiscal positions. They have even lower birth rates. It's unclear how they're going to pay their debts. You got to have somewhere to put the money, right? The dollar is still the world's reserve currency, all of that stuff. But we're running deficits that 20 years ago, people would have thought were just insane and unsustainable. We're going 40, 50% above intake year after year after year with no recession. That's crazy. It's crazy. And we just do it and we don't even think about it. We're like, we'll borrow some more. Not a big deal. So we'll see. I think it's quite bad. I don't know where the break point is, and I'm not sure anyone else does either. There's a moment when the markets turn on us. I just don't know when it is.
And tariffs aren't going to solve this problem.
And tariffs are not going to solve those problems. Tariffs cannot solve those problems. And tariffs are a tax. This is an important point. Tariffs are just another tax. They're not really a sales tax. They're a tax on certain kinds of inputs, but they probably pass through mostly to consumers eventually. To the extent that foreign sovereigns don't retaliate, which I hadn't expected, maybe they're bearing part of it, but we're bearing most of it, I think is the right way to say it. I think that's the right way to say it.
Yeah, my understanding from what I've seen Goldman reports and some of the economic reports is that there is this broad expectation in both the business analyst community and among economists that at the end of the day, over half of the tariff cost probably will get passed on to U.S. consumers. Maybe some of it gets eaten by the suppliers. Some of it maybe long-term gets eaten into margins, although companies are not typically known for doing things out of the generosity of their corporate hearts. Maybe some of it, either through exchange rate adjustments or through kind of business negotiations, get passed on to the foreign producers. But I'm interested, do you have views on what the distributional impacts of tariffs as taxes are? I hear a lot that this is a regressive tax. I hear other arguments that maybe it's just like a consumption tax. Curious if you have views on the tax policy side of this, aside from revenue.
Right. So consumption taxes are regressive in the sense that they fall more deeply on people who spend more of their income consuming, and it's the wealthy who have some of their income in savings. I have not spent enough time asking whether or not items passed on, items that are getting tariffed are disproportionately consumed by less well-off people or more well-off people. I'll just assume that they're like any other sales tax for purposes of this discussion, at which point they're somewhat regressive. And then the question, when I think about regressivity, there's two sides of whether something's regressive. It's how is the money being raised, and then how is the money being spent? If I thought the spending was being spent all on social services for poor people, then I'd say it doesn't matter how you raise the money.
Mm.
You're still getting some from well-off people, and you're spending all of it on poor people, and so it's progressive. And of course, that's basically what Europe does, high level, right? They have big consumption taxes. Their tax systems, in some sense, are less progressive than ours, but they spend much more progressively. Net, they have a more progressive system, even though actually they rely very heavily on consumption taxes, much more heavily than we do, which are a more regressive tax, but they just spend a lot more progressively. Who cares? But I don't view it as a particularly progressive tax. I view it as a tax that's probably falling disproportionately on people who consume. And if you consume all your money, you consume more than if you save 20% of your money, which the wealthy do, right? They save some income. So it's probably a regressive tax, probably. And I won't claim to have done the analysis myself.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the impact of the tax code on manufacturing in the United States compared to elsewhere. And I want to unpack this in two ways. First, for many years, there's been this political allegation out there that parts of the tax code encourage offshoring and have encouraged various companies to move manufacturing offshore. And I'd be interested if you could unpack that a little bit. How generally does the tax code either encourage offshoring or encourage onshoring of manufacturing? And then I want to drill in a little bit on one particular aspect where there's been a lot of recent argument, particularly by former Security Economics podcast guest Brad Setzer, who's argued that with pharmaceutical manufacturing in particular, the tax code's driven pharmaceutical manufacturing offshore, particularly to Ireland, which he sees as a big winner there.
Pharma is actually the perfect place to see the dynamics because it's an extreme case. You have to understand both how pharma is an extreme case that teaches you things. Now, pharma is an extreme case that you should think of as special, okay? But let's just talk about where we were before 2017. So we actually had a 35% headline corporate income tax in the United States. That was the second highest in the world. Only Japan had a higher one in the developed world. And meanwhile, we had a rule that said if you earn money in foreign subsidiaries offshore and you keep it offshore, you don't owe tax in the U.S. yet. You basically have a 0% rate until you bring the money home. And then there were all kinds of ways to avoid getting taxed when you brought the money home. That was really complicated. So that encouraged companies with lots of intellectual property income to move their intellectual property offshore so as to earn the money in zero or low tax jurisdictions, Ireland having 12.5% at the time, because that meant that income that was associated with that IP would pay 12.5% and not 35%. And that's a lot of money. Think about 12.5 versus 35 on $10 billion. It's like real money, right? It's not a joke. And so
it's worth hiring some lawyers to figure out how to play this game. I can see that.
Hiring some lawyers to figure it out. Exactly. And so they started doing that. And then separately, we had a set of rules back then that said, look, if you have to manufacture the product, some income has to be associated with the manufacturing, not just the IP. And you want that income to be low tax, you might need the manufacturer where the IP is. But if the manufacturer is not going to be where the IP is, you can do this thing called contract manufacturing, where you just give them this really small return because they have no risk. They take no risk. They're just doing what you told them to do. And so they get paid cost plus 7%, cost plus 10%, whatever. Well, it turned out that the way those rules were set up, if you had the IP offshore, you could basically do that, contract manufacturing, anywhere in the world but the United States. So we had rules that basically said, take the IP offshore, and by the way, if you then want to minimize your taxes on the manufacturing piece of it, manufacture anywhere but in the United States.
Wait,
those were actually our rules.
Let me just break this out. So you have an American company, and I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular, you have an American company that's invented a new kind of jet engine or something like that. What it would want to do is actually move the IP design for that to some overseas jurisdiction and then also manufacture it outside the United States. Or maybe a better example would be semiconductor. You would design a semiconductor here, move the IP to a third country, and then manufacture it. So that's actually what the tax code was encouraging.
Basically, if the income associated with the thing that's being sold either is a service or a good that's very light, so it's easy to ship. Shipping turns out to matter a lot, Peter. Shipping matters a lot. Jet engines are hard to ship.
Okay, fair.
Right. Then we basically had rules that said, yeah, you could lower your tax by making sure that the intellectual property was owned offshore. Now, it turns out, of course, that a lot of the original research was done in the US. And so the US has rules about taking IP that is valuable inside the United States and moving it offshore. You pay a tax to do that. It's called 367D of the code. And so you had to do it really early. But of course, there are valuation problems in figuring out what early research is worth, right? Only the company really knows. And so companies would enter into these agreements where basically they'd have their offshore subsidiaries start paying for the research once they thought something was going to be a winner, so that the IP was owned offshore. And they would do that in two different ways. Some people would do it for all of the IP for the world except for the US. They would leave the US market IP in the US. And some people would try to get it all offshore. And in pharma, you had more cases where people try to get it all offshore, including the US market.
So you're inventing a drug here, you're researching a drug here, but you've moved the IP to Ireland to pick a place that does seem to
You're
get...
having the Irish entity fund the research wherever the research is taking place after a certain point where you've decided that thing's a winner. And by funding it, what you're doing is making the IP be owned offshore, which means eventually the profits associated with that IP can be booked offshore. Now, all of this was particularly bad before 2017. Then in 2017, we did something interesting. We actually imposed a kind of global minimum tax. We previously had a 0% rate until you repatriated on offshore income. Now we basically said, and I'm doing this at a 100,000-foot level that my tax colleagues would not agree with, but basically pay on average 13.125% on all of your offshore profits. If you paid less than that to foreign sovereigns on all your offshore profits, pay the difference to the United States. That's still lower than 21%, which is what you're paying in the US, right? And so there's still an incentive to keep stuff offshore.
It's not as large, but there's still an incentive
It's
to do
not
it.
as large, but also recognize sometimes you're earning 28% in Germany. You're paying 28% in Germany, and it's a blended rate. So if you're earning enough in Germany that you're going to pay 28% on, now you've got every incentive to book even more in a 0% jurisdiction to blend the average down to 13.125. Does that make sense? Because for every billion you earn in a high tax country, let's call it Germany, you've got a lot of incentive to earn $1 billion in a zero tax country because, you might as well, right? It's going to lower your taxes in the US. And so people did that. Now, to be clear, that meant that the 2017 reform made the problem less bad, but the problem had not gone away. And I think one problem you have for progressives is they'll sit there and tell you, well, the current system incentivizes offshoring, and they won't say, well, it incentivizes offshoring less than the old system did, but actually we didn't solve the problem, okay? Which is the right way you should say it. That's the right way to say it, but they don't want to say it that way because Republicans, of course, in the end passed the 2017 bill. So you don't want to give them credit for moving it in the right direction. They did move it in the right direction, just not far enough. Now, then you have the problem that this whole thing only works because you have countries in the world that have rates that are well below the US rate. And there were a lot of zero tax countries. And of course, the global minimum tax idea was in part to level the playing field and make it so that in every country in the world, you paid at least 15, which meant that there would be less opportunity for blending because if you're going to pay 15 everywhere in the world, there's no way to blend 0 against 30 anymore. You see what I'm saying? And so that's really helpful if it sticks. But that idea is now in jeopardy, even though some of us worked very, very hard to get 140 countries to agree on it, that there should be a level playing field. There should at least be a 15% tax on profits earned in any individual country anywhere in the world. And therefore, from a US perspective, that would mean there would be less opportunity, among other things, for blending and for pushing tax rates down, which also would lower US taxable income. Now, I say all of that because to stop incentives for offshoring, you need two things to happen. First of all, you needed a tax incentive to force income to be booked abroad rather than in the United States to be relatively low. It doesn't have to be 0 because it's kind of uncomfortable to do the tax planning. It produces various kinds of problems. And at some point, it's just not worth the energy. If there's a small gap between what you're going to pay on profits booked in the US and profits booked abroad, doesn't matter. If there's a bigger gap, tax planners will take advantage of that, and it'll be worth it for them to do it. And at the end of the day, the corporate C-suite's job is to maximize profitability and dividends and after-tax profitability, and so they'll go along with it. And that's just where we are. Now, the interesting thing about pharma that makes it complicated is pharma is an industry where, first of all of the value is in a product, and the product is really light because the active ingredient's super light, and also the overwhelming majority of the profitability of the industry is in the United States.
We do pay more than anywhere else.
We pay much more for our pharma than anyone else, right? We subsidize research for the world, which meant that in pharma, the incentive was to move the IP offshore with respect to the US, not just with respect to the rest of the world. So you weren't just booking in Ireland your profits for the rest of the world and keeping your US-based profits in the US. You actually had a lot of incentives to actually take the IP rights even for the US out of the US and then make the active ingredient outside the US and then ship it back into the US. And that really did happen. The fact is that if you have a global minimum tax and you have the regime that is now in place in the United States after the 2017 Act and after the 2025 Act, which is this foreign derived deduction eligible income provision that basically says, look, if you make something in the US and you sell it abroad, we're going to only charge you 14% tax on that. Then if there's a 15% tax abroad and there's a 14% rate in the US, there's never an incentive to offshore. Okay? That system works. But if the rest of the world can go back to zero, then even the US having a 14% rate isn't worth it, because on $10 billion, the difference between 0 and 14 is $1.4 billion. And I'll do a lot for $1.4 billion as a company. Does that make sense? So you need both. You need both features.
No, that does make a ton of sense. And I remember the Biden administration, and you got sent out to do a lot of this work, was advocating very much for this global minimum tax as a way of dealing with some of these offshoring issues. My understanding is that Trump administration is against this global minimum tax concept. What is their rationale for pivoting away from this system the Treasury Department had been advocating?
I mean, their rationale is basically, look, we were ceding too much sovereignty because we were agreeing to have a global rules-based order, right? That had some parameters that every country in the world was supposed to abide by, including not pushing your rate below an effective tax rate of 15%. And they didn't like that.
So they didn't like that we were committing to keeping our corporate tax rate at 15.
That was a big part of it. And separately, there's just the reality that I think there's a tax lobbying community out there. It's important to understand there's the whole tax lobbying world, and the biggest point that the tax lobbying community made in international tax for 25 years was that we need a level playing field. There's this competitiveness problem because U.S. taxes in the corporate side are higher than corporate taxes everywhere else. And so they said level playing field, level playing field, level playing field. But I think some of them really, when they said that, what they meant was, well, the rest of the world is in a race to zero, and we should go to zero too, And what the Biden administration did is they figured out a way to meet the level playing field point, which was the single biggest talking point of the international tax business community for 25 years, right? Like the international tax lobbying community, without going to zero.
Level at 15. Yeah,
exactly. Exactly. They were like, no, not that level. That's not the level we meant. We meant zero. And so they dropped that point, and then they ran to Republicans, told them to oppose it. And I think certain U.S. multinational groups, particularly very heavily IP-driven groups in very particular industries, could get well below 15 and wanted to be able to stay there. And remember, a lot of the tax lobbying takes place at the tax director level and the head of tax level. At the end of the day, these guys are basically compensated to keep the effective tax rate down. And their personal comp is on the line when the ETR goes up, and it doesn't matter that it's Congress's fault, right? So there's a lot of energy around it. There's a lot of energy. They got Republicans to flip on the global minimum tax and hate it. And I think the sovereignty thing that they felt like, look, we're agreeing to multilateralism and now we hate multilateralism was a really important part of that, to be frank. And so they became fully opposed. I don't know how much you want to talk about GMT. I could talk about it forever. As you know, Peter, I spent 2 years of my life doing nothing but. So I can keep talking about this, but I'll let you ask a question instead if you want to.
Or I appreciate that. Let me actually ask you about the other part of the Biden administration's international tax agenda, which is also something we've seen Trump at times talk about in the context of his trade deals, which was trying to at least cabin the way in which foreign governments were going to tax digital services overseas. I remember when I was in the White House, the tech community came in and advocated very hard against digital services taxes, including to the national security community, as hindering U.S. innovation and discrimination against U.S. firms. And if you just unpack a little bit what this debate about digital services taxes is.
I think it's very interesting, right? Because when the people came into the national security counsel from the public affairs groups, the big tech companies. They were against digital services taxes because they were discriminatory. And it is true that they were discriminatory. These were these targeted taxes that basically said, if but only if you're a market platform or a social media company or a search engine, right? And if but only if you have revenues, global revenues above a certain threshold.
I remember they had like user thresholds and revenue thresholds that were basically, it was the equivalent of gerrymandering, where they'd like artfully constructed this so it only captured American firms. So I have to give somebody some grudging credit. They had really figured out a way to only capture the U.S. firms.
They had only U.S. companies. It was really clear. And I will tell you, I was sitting in the Treasury and I had the lead role to both fight DSTs and to negotiate this global minimum tax. And when you talked to the people who weren't the tax people about it, it was very clear the reason they were fighting it was not because the digital services tax itself was going to be so utterly expensive at 3%. It was because it set a precedent for discrimination against these companies. That's what they were upset about. And I found that persuasive. I thought they were discriminatory. I thought that every normative theory foreigners came up to defend them with was convoluted and bogus. So there was this user participation in value creation concept, right? But if you took it seriously as a justification for digital services taxes, it wouldn't just have applicability to the creation of value in digital business models. It would also apply in pharmaceuticals, right? Because you got to do clinical trials. And it would also apply in financial services. You'd go on and on. Like, it made no sense. And the Europeans were pretty hypocritical in building this system. Like, let's have a principled rule. Here's the thing. All of my views were based on the concept of a rules-based international economic order that should have non-discriminatory rules at its heart, right? And Donald Trump has clearly blown up that entire concept. It's gone. It's gone. And the companies, therefore, will have no principled argument going forward for why DSTs are wrong. Because what are they going to say? Well, we're fine with all the U.S. rules. We're fine with the U.S. discriminating as between countries with respect to tariffs. We're fine with Donald Trump discriminating as between even individual companies at times. All of that is fine. But somehow, for tax policy and digital services, it has to be non-discriminatory. I have no idea why that's right anymore without the normative foundation of what I'm grudgingly, sadly starting to call the prior rules-based order. If discrimination is not a problem, then are these taxes problematic? That's an interesting question. Right?
I hadn't thought about that. That's a very fair point. If we are now in a power-based order rather than a rules-based order, right now we might be able to fend off foreign digital services taxes because we have the bulk of the power, and that's the reality of a power-based order. But if some of these other countries succeed in getting some relative power and leverage, we don't really have a principles-based argument as to why they shouldn't extract revenue from the digital platforms anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I thought we had a principles-based argument. This is discriminatory. This is obviously discriminatory. You guys are out of your minds. You have all these like BS justifications, but come on, you just built the perfect system to only hit U.S. firms. You've got to be kidding me. Everything else is just putting icing on to make it look prettier. But now you got to ask, how do you feel about these taxes without thinking that discrimination is a problem? And then you say, I don't know. In fact, these are industries with oligopolistic features that are powerfully influenced by network effects. So maybe if it isn't perfect tax and it doesn't hit all businesses that, are in that architecture, well, it's still hitting some of them. It's imposing on a subset of those businesses. It isn't perfectly targeted, but maybe it's not a total disaster. Then the question is the tax administrable? It turns out it's not that administrable because the data you need to get at to determine whether the users of any digital service are in a particular jurisdiction is available only from the taxpayer you're trying to get to pay.
Yes, that's true, right? If you're X, if you're Elon, you might decide we're just not going to tell the Europeans how many users we have.
That's exactly right. It's a big problem. And not only that, it turns out that it's compliance work that actually you have very little other incentive to engage in because you don't really care whether the person's in French or Belgium. You know it's in French. You know the ad's in French, but you yourself, the advertiser doesn't really care because it's all in the EU market. You don't care. The only reason you're doing the compliance work is to pay the tax. So that's a problem, okay? There are probably better ways to go after more revenue from big tech and just big tech if people want to. But I would just point out, it used to be that we would say, well, the problem with writing a rule that says just go after US big tech is that it's discriminatory. I don't know if that argument's going to fly anymore. I think that argument's dead.
Thinking of taxes on big tech, and we talked about tariffs. Another novel tax that President Trump has come up with has been this apparent effort to tax NVIDIA and AMD on their sales to China. Let's bracket for a minute the fact the Constitution has a prohibition on export taxes, which maybe you could come up with a workaround for since these are actually being exported from Taiwan. Let's talk policy. I was struck by, I think I intuitively think this is not a great idea. But I did see Mark Cuban, former Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban, made this point online. He's like, hey, you Democrats, you've been trying completely unsuccessfully for 20 years to get tech companies to pay more in taxes. And here Donald Trump he seems to have figured out how to get at least a little bit of money out of a tech company, and maybe you have to hand it to him. I'm curious what you make of, again, putting aside legality and constitutionality issues, of this idea of export taxes that seems to be coming into our ecosystem.
What it reminds me of is the British East India Company. That's what it reminds me of, right? In the 17th century. This is how it worked, right? You guys get to sell there, but you pay us. That was the British East India Company.
I love this piece of history here. I had not thought about that, but you're absolutely right. That's the historical analogy of this.
Yeah, totally. And then think that through further, right? Are you going to provide political and military cover for a company? Well, in that world, countries did, but the companies paid for it. Now let's assume that Scott Bessent is serious and this is just a model. It's not a one-time special situation that'll never happen again. It's a possible model. So now let's think about the DST thing again. Imagine that we get to the point when countries have made some of the adjustments they need to make to deal with this very different kind of United States, right? Because right now they just want to wait it out. You see a lot of foreign sovereigns whose basic position is, we weren't ready for this. We never thought this would happen. And we just have to placate them until Donald Trump is gone or we figure out some other stuff. That's how I understand the world to be right now. But come to the end of the administration or the start of the next one, let's say that the Europeans, for example, no longer need the U.S. on side for purposes of Ukraine, which is a big reason they're staying on side. If we get to the point where Europe doesn't need U.S. military support to deal with Russia anymore, I wouldn't be surprised if all of a sudden the foreigners say, let's use our anti-coercion instrument to do some really radical things. For example, I can imagine one really radical thing that they could do. They could say, hey, we noticed that the copies of the AI models to serve Europe are almost always physically held in Europe. And the reason for that has to do with latency issues. Maybe that'll change, but that's a technological fact today. Why not force Google and Meta and maybe OpenAI to sell all their AI models to Mistral? Because they don't pay enough tax, and we think this is a national security issue of ours now. And then you would say, oh, but come on, you can't do that. That's discriminatory. That's violating all of our precedents about like how we think about fair treatment among companies headquartered in different places. What are you doing? And then the U.S. government will be like, well, we're going to fight you back. We're not going to let you do that. The tech companies will run to the U.S. government and say, fight them. Tell them horrible things are going to happen to them. Retaliate against them. And you know what? Post NVIDIA deal, U.S. government might say, that's fine. We'll fight them for you. There's just a fee. Right? You got to pay us. You got to pay us 10% of revenues in Europe, and then we'll fight them about it. Then we'll tell them there's no defense from Russia whatsoever, but by the way, it costs you 15% of revenue. That's the world we're heading to, isn't it? That's where this goes, this NVIDIA world, if it becomes the model. That's what I see.
This is such an interesting point. Yeah, that may be where we're headed.
Version, right? That's super extreme, but there you go.
I'm just picturing how some of the tech companies would have reacted 3 or 4 years ago if they come to the Biden administration and say, we want you to fight the DSTs. And our response had been, sure, we'll fight the DSTs, but actually half the savings we want to pocket. I mean, it's just, you know.
We want a revenue share. That's right.
That is kind of the model here that Trump has opened up for the government. Interesting.
And that's interesting, right? I'm not sure it's going to solve the fiscal crisis, but it's a revenue stream.
Yeah, it's true. It is a revenue stream. Money's got to come from somewhere, right?
Somewhere.
Okay. Look, I just have a couple of final questions for you. I know we're coming to the end of our time and you've been very generous with your time. First, what do you think on tax policy Trump is doing right? I hear a lot of criticism of Trump on tax policy, a lot of criticism of tariffs. But what do you think he's doing right on tax policy?
I mean, I actually think most of it is a dumpster fire. But there are some things that I really actually do think are good. One of them that I just mentioned is the FDDEI provision. The Biden administration did it first. I mean, well, the Trump administration did it, and then the Biden administration verified it. Once you give up on WTO rules on subsidies and countervailing measures, because you're not going to bring the WTO back, then it does make sense to impose a lower tax rate on foreign derived income than on domestically derived income. And I am glad that we in OB3 kept FDDEI. We revised FDII to make it FDDEI and imposed a 14% rate effectively on sales of foreign derived eligible income. I thought that was a good idea, but I think it's only a good idea if the global minimum tax survives, because it goes back to this point that I made, which is you need two things to encourage companies to book revenue in the US and therefore have the US raise more money from those sales. Number one, you need the US rate to be competitive with the foreign rate, but that means both that the US rate has to be reasonably low and that the foreign rates have to be high enough. In other words, 14% is not low enough if the foreigners can get to zero. I basically think the FDDEI thing is right, but it's being undermined by the approach that the administration is taking on the global minimum tax, which may kill it. It's not for sure yet, but if I were a foreign multinational, I would be going to my government saying, look, we were okay with this regime when everyone was going to have to face it. But once you exempt the US, which is the source of almost half of the corporate profits in the world from the regime, it's not clear to me why I'm facing this regime anymore and why I have to face a harsher regime than they do. Why don't you just abandon this whole thing? And that's the next part of the conversation. It would be nice if we could sustain the global minimum tax to provide the level playing field that would make FDDEI work, which would then allow the United States to raise revenue from U.S. companies bringing IP back into the United States, and then both manufacturing here for sale abroad and booking services here for sale abroad, and thereby benefiting from the revenue accordingly. That would be really great. And they've done a couple of the things that need to happen to make that happen, but on the other part, on the GMT part, they're doing a terrible job.
Thanks for that. One final question, which is probably the one you get from friends and relatives when they realize you teach tax law, which is personal advice. What personal advice do you give people on how they should think about their taxes?
Oh my God. So first of all, as a tax professor, you're always told not to give personal advice in a recorded way. Don't do that. If you want to talk to a student about their personal tax problem, only once the recording is off.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But I mean, what I would say is we have a really, really complicated system for tax preferred savings. Most of the people who listen to this podcast are people who happen to be in the privileged part of the American population that actually gets to save. It's really worth taking the time. It's just amazing how many people I run into who don't understand all the tax preferred vehicles and don't take advantage of them, even when they're in the right range of incomes. Let's just say people who make high 6-digit salaries, but not like high 7-digit salaries. The number of those people who don't fully take advantage of tax preferred savings vehicles to lower their tax burden is actually surprising to me.
That's good advice. That's good advice. I suspect we have some listeners who will appreciate that. Your tax advisor. Itai, thanks so much for this. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thanks for joining.
Okay. Thanks so much. All right.
And that's a wrap. I'd like to thank Itai Grinberg for joining the Security Economics podcast, and I'd like to thank all of you for listening. We'll see you soon.